From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Julia Carcatzel. It's Monday, April 17. At the end of this month, the Liddell coal-fired power station will be shut down. It's a station that has dominated the Hunter Valley skyline for half a century.
Countdown has begun for the source of almost 1/6 of our state's power generation. It's the coal-fired Liddell power station set to be decommissioned.
Its fall will represent the end of an era in the Hunter region, but the power station's closure also holds great national significance. But how is Australia really tracking when it comes to a transition away from coal and towards renewable energy? And what will come of the communities left behind? Today, environment reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald, Laura Chung, on the closure of one of Australia's oldest coal-fired power stations and the lessons we can learn from it. Laura, you had the chance to visit the Liddell coal-fired power station earlier this month. What were your impressions of the site, and can you tell me a bit about its history and surrounding community?
So I think we all know the Hunter Valley region is obviously really famous for wine and thoroughbred breeding, but it's also really, really famous for its coal production. So the Hunter Valley has a lot of coal mines and a lot of coal-fired power stations. So immediately, you're drawn to this giant structure that sort of stands out in the middle of the rolling hills and the farmland that sort of surrounds the Liddell power station. But immediately as you sort of drive up to the gates, you can see these huge columns. They're about 168 metres high. And then the station itself, which I guess is this giant building that sort of looks like the inside of a machine. This power station has sort of dominated the Hunter Valley landscape for 52 years. So a lot of people who now work at the station had family working there, or they've sort of grown up and, driven to school and driven to TAFE passing this power station. So it's very much a significant landmark. In terms of the power station output, in a year it sort of produces 6,000 gigawatts of electricity, which is enough to power about 750,000 average Australian family homes. Liddell and its neighbouring Bayswater station, which is also owned by electricity giant AGL, provides up to about 30% of the state's power supply. This decision to close Liddell has sort of been in the works for 7 years. Liddell has given the market plenty of notice that it is going to be shutting down. And I guess as we sort of get into the last final weeks, the workers are just saying goodbye to the station that many of them have grown up with or heard about through their families. We're also starting to wind down operations and just finish that final chapter that has been Liddell for the past 52 years.
Okay, and one of the locals you spoke to was a man named Jackson Shannon. Can you tell me a bit about him?
That's right. So Jackson's family is really, really interesting. He is a third-generation Liddell worker. So his grandfather actually started working at the power station. He was driving cement trucks during that construction phase in the 60s.
And then worked as a on-shift power worker, and then my mum worked here as a cleaner. And
his parents then actually met at the station.
And then she met my dad, who was an electrician at the time.
And then Jackson went through TAFE, and when it was time for him to find a job, Liddell was obviously one of the places that he was considering, and ultimately, because of that family history, he decided to take up that role there.
And a lot of that was to do with mum and dad working here, and they'd sort of said how good it was. And
he's been there for quite a few years, and he is, really proud that he's been able to carry on that family legacy of working at the Liddell power station.
He'd already passed away by the time I came back, so he never got to see me come back after my apprenticeship, but I'd say he would have been pretty proud for me to come back here. So, yeah.
But for him, as that, chapter sort of draws to a close, he'll be one of those many workers, about 68% of the workforce, that is going to be moving over to Bayswater, that neighbouring station I talked about earlier. Many of the other workers are either, moving on to other opportunities or are taking voluntary redundancies because it is a slightly older workforce.
How do you feel about it?
I'm nervous. I've spent a little bit of time at Bayswater, but you build so many relationships here and whatnot, so being able to go talk to operators and be able to work in with them, and you've built those relationships over the last 3 years, and then to go over there and you've then got to go and build them again, and you've got to prove yourself.
So Laura, why is the Liddell power plant being shut down now?
So, initially the company sort of explored whether it was viable to keep the station alive and to extend its life. But this comes with huge cost. And Liddell is a really aging infrastructure because it has been open for 52 years. So AGL was sort of left with one option, which is to transition it into a renewable energy hub. And this is something that we've seen a lot of coal-fired power stations, both in Australia and overseas, start to explore. This is because they've got really good transmission lines and they've got that support that already connects them to the grid. I think, more broadly, obviously, we have seen that phase out of coal and we've seen the industry start to explore, what comes next in terms of our electricity makeup. And that is renewables. In terms of where we are in that renewable development, we do need to increase our investment in the sector. And that is something that both governments and the private sector is currently exploring.
Okay, so I understand the site will turn into a kind of renewable energy hub. Can you describe that process?
So what has been approved for the site is a grid-scale battery, which is really, really exciting. But, in the future, we could also see AGL expand into solar, wind and hydrogen. And this transition is sort of expected to occur post-2026 once that Liddell power station has been demolished. So in terms of what comes next for Liddell, it is sort of a multi-layer process. It's sort of taken us 7 years for AGL to come up with a process that will work. And it's sort of, easily broken down into 3 parts. So firstly, that involves turning off the station itself, which is going to happen on April 28. And then they've got to clean and dry out all the equipment. And that process takes about 6 months. The next sort of stage is the gradual dismantle of the building itself. So this means that those huge chimneys that I spoke about earlier are going to be blown up in a really controlled explosion. And then we'll see gradual parts of the station just being taken away in trucks and workers hanging up their hard hats and moving to other opportunities or other power stations. I guess what is really interesting is that, AGL is really hoping that what happens at Liddell is a blueprint for the remaining 18 coal-fired power stations across the rest of the country.
Okay, so Laura, tell me more about some of the concerns we're hearing from politicians and others over the closure of Liddell and other stations. The importance of baseload power is raised quite a lot in these debates. What's your understanding of this?
It's a good question, and everyone seems to be really concerned. Are the lights going to go out?
Power facility. Now, it's an old plant, Liddell coal-fired power station, but our power system's just not ready for it to shut early.
In the case of Liddell, AGL did tell the market 7 years ago. So the market has had ample warning to sort of prepare for Liddell shutting down. And AEMO, who is, the energy market operator, is very confident that there's going to be sort of enough energy and capacity as we move forward. I think, the closure of Liddell represents sort of a bigger issue, which is, there needs to be much more investment in renewable projects as other coal-fired power stations start to close around the country. At the moment, we're expecting to sort of double that current pace of investment in the renewable energy projects if we are to meet the federal government's targets of 82 renewables by 2030.
I wanted to chat about AGL because while AGL's closure of Liddell may offer a blueprint for other companies and their renewable energy transitions, we have to put this into context. The company was one of Australia's biggest emitters in 2021 of greenhouse gases. And this is what we're seeing on a bigger scale, right? So we have these 2 narratives of phasing out coal, while also the approval of over 100 new coal, oil and gas projects. How are we tracking really when it comes to Australia's renewable energy transition?
It's a good question, and I think, it is one that is definitely worth asking. I think since the Labor federal government came into power in May last year, we've sort of seen a almost doubling in renewable energy projects that have got the green light. So I think we're a country that has historically been dominated by coal and gas and oil, but I think we are slowly starting to see that transition. I know a lot of the experts I've spoken to have said, over the past decade, the federal government has previously slowed down a lot of energy and climate policy. But now, since we've seen Labor get in, we've started to see a resurgence and bigger investment in renewable energy projects, which I think is quite an exciting time. I think my response to that is always to ask these experts, have we missed the boat? Are we too late? And a lot of them say, look, it's better late than never. And what we do now is sort of going to really impact in 5 or 10 years when, these questions of do we have enough energy and electricity is going to come into more importance.
Okay, so energy reliability and the global demand for coal exports are one thing. The people and community of these towns are another. What will happen to the locals and decades-long workers like those at the Liddell power plant once it's been demolished?
It's a good question. And I think, given how important Liddell has been for a lot of these workers, it's, something they've passed every day going to school and they've grown up with. AGL has said, it is really important for them to ensure that smooth transition for their workforce. Not only are they making sure that the technical aspects of the demolition go smoothly, but also supporting, the hundreds and thousands of people that have gone through their doors since Liddell first opened its doors in 1971. I think we do have examples of communities that have been left behind, and this is, particularly seen in coal-fired power plant stations that have closed over a 6-month period, such as Hazelwood in Victoria. But in the case of Liddell, they have notified the market 7 years ago. They have really prepared their workforce for that. And over the last year, they've sort of been gradually reducing their workforce to that core staff and ensuring that they provide them with the great opportunities at, other neighbouring power stations. I think it is a really, really interesting case, and for a community and region like the Hunter Valley, which has relied so much on coal, it is going to be really interesting to see what a lot of that workforce does. I know I've spoken to quite a few young people over the years who've sort of said, while they work in the coal industry now, they don't foresee themselves staying there like their grandfathers or parents once did, and they're now starting to take other opportunities like doing masters in IT, just to try and bolster their skill set and prepare for that future where coal is not so heavily reliant as it once was.
I think coal-fired power stations, I think the technology is old, but it's still it's baseload power, and at the moment we don't have anything else that's really being able to provide the same sort of baseload power. But I think definitely the technology coming through now, your pumped hydro and all that sort of stuff, it's really, really good, and it's really up and coming, and I think it'll 100% be part of the future of the electrical network here in Australia.
Well, thank you for your analysis today, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by me, Julia Karkatzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Julia Karkatzel. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.